It's a real pleasure to be here today, especially as the South African story is part of my heritage. Many of my family are from here, and it's a place where my parents grew up, so it's great to be back. This is a lithograph by a South African artist called Peggy Delport. It was a poster for a sit-in at UCT in 1968, protesting the rescinded appointment of Archie Mafeji as a senior lecturer from the Department of African Studies. It's also an artifact from my parents' first date at that sit-in, and has for many years hung in my family home. For me, it's a really evocative reminder of the power of creativity and collective action. These are themes that I really understand resonate with design and Jarber's ethos, and so today we're planning to sort of talk through these themes through our own experience of practice. James and I are two of the co-founders of Assemble, a collective who work across the fields of architecture, art, and design. We're based in Sugar House Studios in London, where we work in a multidisciplinary environment alongside artists, designers, and craftspeople. We do work across a range of scales, from sort of furniture projects to installations, theatre design, workspace, as well as civic spaces. We feel that the city can be a very disempowering place, and as a practice, we're really interested in addressing disconnection between the public and the way that our buildings and the built environment are made. After all, cities are man-made and material. So over the past 5 years, we've investigated a range of strategies that explore that gap and try and make the city more malleable. So we believe that architecture is very much composed of sort of economics, policy, brief building, and the process of construction, not just building design. We've got a very broad approach, so we often initiate our own projects, we set up new organizations, we run spaces and events, we build projects ourselves, and we also are interested in opening up the building process to others. We're really interested in different ways that you can engage with the city, and for us, the best way to do that is through direct action and experimentation. This attitude has really been informed for us by our first project together, which was called the Cineroleum. So, 5 years ago, when we were mostly recent graduates from architecture school, we decided to get together and try to develop a project from conception to construction. So we built the Cineroleum. It was a cinema formed out of a disused petrol station in Clerkenwell Road in London. We sort of reinterpreted the rituals and elements of cinema, so we sort of sewed an enormous festoon curtain, which was made with a silvery metallic material that's normally used for roofing underlay, and enclosed the petrol station canopy, where there was sort of a bank of seats, of cinema seats made from scaffold boards. We then ran the cinema for a month, showing films from road movies to science fiction. At the end of each screening, we would raise the curtain up so that the audience was suddenly visible on the street and very much exposed to passers-by. As one member of the audience described it, it was like having your pants pulled down in public. The design of the Cineroleum was very much developed through sort of iterative testing, and we sort of broke down methods and techniques into basic production lines so that we could invite volunteers onto the site and everyone could get involved in the construction process. So this is an example of one of our sort of manuals for making, which illustrates how you can make a flip-up cinema seat from a scaffold board. The elements were all really evidently handmade, yet they transformed cheap industrial materials into something far more theatrical. They also juxtaposed the petrol station, making it feel like it was something more improvisational and open-ended. The process of building was really key for us. It was, in many ways, our first studio, and where we really learnt the value of building as a collective activity. It was also the space where we really first began to test out materials as well as our ideas. For us, the Cineroleum has been a really poignant project, and it has really begun to inform an approach which says, how can I make the city no longer have a city that is no longer opaque and unquestionable, but instead malleable and full of possibility?
So our next two projects, Folly for Flavour and our first permanent built project, which is a new town square in outer London. Both kind of took this idea of very direct and visible kind of action on site, and tried to use them as a way of kind of effecting a change in maybe the way that people in a local area who were familiar with a space kind of perceived it to be. So this was a kind of a motorway undercroft in Hackney Wick in East London, very close to the Olympic site, which was kind of all under construction at this time. And hundreds of people would walk past this site each day. The kind of towpath next to the canal was extremely kind of popular route, but this metal railing that separated the site from that towpath kind of really made it quite invisible in people's consciousness when they walked past. It wasn't a space they'd really appreciate or relate to in any way. It was just sort of invisible, despite its kind of fantastic dramatic qualities. These two roadways which kind of split in the middle, very dramatic kind of situation of infrastructure. And so we proposed to build in the middle of this a public house built of 10,000 timber bricks that suggested a kind of alternate history for the site. A kind of public event space, theatre space, cinema, would host workshops and things during the day. We kind of drew on this fictional narrative of a stubborn homeowner who'd kind of refused to sell his land to the authority when it came to building the motorway. And he sort of sat in the middle like a nail house and forced the kind of mighty infrastructure to go in a totally different direction. And the materiality of this project was very kind of peculiar. It sort of drew, it was sort of playfully kind of weird and odd and quite surreal. And visibly imperfect. It was kind of made by many hands. Again, like learning from some of those things in the Cinerolium about the kind of techniques which could be applied, enabled many people to kind of come on site and participate in the construction. And it kind of picked up on a wider story in the area, that there were lots of kind of brick buildings in places like Hackney Wick and locally that were being kind of demolished as part of the Olympic works. These kind of things which had a very particular value to people that kind of knew the area, were familiar with it. And in lots of cases, there was this extraordinary kind of variety in the local brickwork. So we tried to kind of build an inventory of this and kind of represent that through the kind of quirkiness of the project that we built, in the kind of coin details at the corner of the walls and things like that, and the blind windows. And again, the process on site was a very open one. We sort of cut a big hole in the fence, so that became sort of part of the domain of the towpath. And people could sort of walk onto the site almost incidentally. It became a kind of thoroughfare during this kind of 4-week period of construction, so that people could come on for sort of 10 minutes, 2 hours, come back for a few days if it was something that they kind of became interested in. But the realization of the project didn't take place behind a hoarding. It was very, very visible that this transformation was taking place and that something was going to happen on the site. And there was a similarly open kind of program of events when it came to actually kind of running things on the site, this kind of program of free workshops and things which we spent a long time kind of putting together with lots of local organizations. And then in the evening, a very cheap program of theatre. The tickets were sort of £2 for the 400-odd seat auditorium, which you can see on the left here. And if you didn't have a ticket, but you just kind of stumbled upon it, you could sort of sit in the forefront of the building and kind of still watch that program. So I think this idea of kind of suggesting an alternative, kind of fictional, quite imaginative, surprising past for a site as a way of suggesting how, perhaps this quite uncelebrated space might have a kind of a different future, a more civic future, might be kind of brought back into the city rather than left as this kind of marginal space, was quite an important kind of idea that we took over to our first built project, which followed on about a year after the Folly project. Again, one where we tried to use the kind of techniques of a very kind of direct and visible activity on site as a way of suggesting how the new public space in New Addington might be. The project was to renew the sort of civic square at the centre of this town in outer London. And the space itself was very sort of harsh and municipal. It had some pragmatic issues. The kind of square itself was kind of sandwiched between two car parks, and it kind of acted as a third informal car park. You can see the kind of rubber marks from all the boy racers who kind of rag across it. So it felt quite dangerous. There wasn't a lot of activity that it was able to kind of support meaningfully in the space. And within this kind of context, there had been, there was a sort of culture of promise fatigue that the residents described it as. This idea that, they talked to architects a lot. They were tired of talking to architects, and nothing kind of coming of it. So there were two things that were very important from the very beginning. One of those was to demonstrate that actually there this kind of extraordinary wealth of activities going on in many of the community buildings, the kind of adult learning centre, spaces like that, but they weren't visible. None of these things had a kind of presence out in the kind of more public realm of New Addington. And the second was that this process was going to lead to some change. It was different from the ones that had come before, and it was very important that people did participate in that conversation about the future of their space. There was at the time, it kind of followed the riots, and there was a lot of sentiment that what really needed to be done was to secure the space, more security cameras and more things like that. Spending on design was seen as a bit of a luxury. So trying to engage people in the idea that, that physical changes could lead to, the same kind of ultimate end goal, which is a kind of a safer and more pleasant kind of urban environment for the residents, was very important. So we spent about sort of 5 months in residence in this little building on the left, which was kind of a make-do community centre. An organisation called Pathfinders were kind of housed in there, who'd been kind of important in the process of appointing us in the first place. It's kind of like enthusiastic people they thought they got a lot of energy out of. And we put together quite a pragmatic set of plans to deal with issues like the car park, but also to develop a kind of set of tools in the space, in the square, that would demonstrate in a very practical way how other activities could be supported. Some of the things from these buildings around the square could come out and kind of start to kind of animate that space. And then we built these all at one-to-one, this kind of set of series of these tests, this kind of temporary stage set. So we brought the kind of old people's tea dance out with a load of heaters and some biscuits, and kind of put them out in the square to do their dancing in a very public place. And made these kind of skatable edges and soft play, put those kinds of things out in the square to encourage the children to use the space in a very different way, the kids, the kind of the teenagers. And also try to sort of build momentum behind the idea that this was the space where the kind of big community activities should happen. There was at Christmas there was a big coming together, at the summertime there was a big fete, but these always happened in different locations around, the venues would change every year. And to promote the idea that this was the space where those kinds of activities should have a home. And these then very directly informed the actual built works, the kind of the final series of projects that were realized. So taking one of the very successful kind of spaces that was used by the community in the community center, picking up on the kind of floor pattern, the herringbone floor pattern in that really kind of popular space, and bringing that out into the square as this kind of new public stage platform for performances. And learning from those kind of very provisional kind of skate ramps and things that had been very successful in terms of giving the kids something different to do, rather than kind of sit on the benches, sit on the back of a bench like they had in the old square, which gave them an ability to sort of territorialize the space. So just kind of trying to provide sort of prompts, different ways in which people could then kind of use the square that were maybe a bit different to the way in which municipal or like kind of authorities would usually treat the space, with kind of spikes and trying to discourage things like skating and cycling. And these were all quite effective tactics in kind of promoting the idea that this was a space which, through a series of kind of temporary interventions, could have a very different kind of future with some quite practical design moves and a different kind of materiality and kind of generosity in the way that these things were kind of realized.
So over the past few years, we've begun to develop a number of independent organizations. So here we've really moved beyond the sort of physical and material aspects of the project to focus on setting up the organizations, the culture that they themselves create, and the type of activities they provide for. So this is Baltic Street Adventure Playground, a playground which we developed alongside families, children, and play workers. The project was originally a commission for the 2014 Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. And it was a response, a very immediate and practical response to, I suppose, a condition of sort of quite harsh urban scarcity for the children who grow up in Dalmarnock, which is in East Glasgow. When we went there was a sort of very hostile environment, and we're very much struck by the lack of provision for children, but also the very aggressive environment set up by sort of the continual hoardings of development sites for the Commonwealth Games. And it struck us that, that hoardings might only be up for a few years, but that represents a child's entire lifetime. And so we really wanted to do something that would give them the sort of the freedom and the capacity to feel like they had the ability to shape the world around them. So in this project, formal design really took a back seat, and we focused on the sort of physical and social infrastructure that would enable this playful and creative environment. So the key elements of the playground are mud, water, hammers, saws, as well as a campfire that sort of is lit every day in the playground to cook food for the children. What it is a sort of constantly evolving environment where children have the sort of the freedom to explore, to play, and to learn new tools, but all supported by some sort of very well-trained play workers who take a back seat and allow the children to get on with it. So what it is really a space where they're constantly affecting change in their own environment and learning and developing their skills and independence. And for us, we really believe that risk and experimentation and adventure are fundamental to childhood, and that this is really what the playground aims to support. And beyond that, it's very important to beginning to ask questions about who we want to be within the city. So I think it's sort of got broader messages. As I mentioned earlier, we're based at Sugar House Studios, where we work alongside designers and craftspeople and artists. It's a type of work that we find incredibly rewarding, but is increasingly difficult in London, where sort of rising property prices mean that the sort of history of getting an old warehouse or light industrial building are no longer really viable. So we decided to develop a project that could aim to address that and could try to explore the sort of themes of collaborative working that we're really interested in. And that project was called Yard House. So what it was is a project to set up a new, low-cost, affordable workspace within London, which can be built on interim sites which were awaiting longer-term development. The structure is really our version of an Amish barn, a 3-aisle timber structure with private studio spaces on each side and a double-height central volume, which was a sort of circulation and collaboration. It was built using sort of systematized off-the-shelf materials. So it meant that we could build it ourselves. And really the investment went in the sort of infrastructure, the shell, and the communal space. Tenants were then sort of able to fit out the spaces themselves, which meant that they both had an investment in the project, but also it meant that were able to keep the costs down. For the facade of the building, we cast 1,500 pigmented concrete tiles. These aim to celebrate and make visible a type of production in the city that is often unseen. For us, it forms a new public space in the yard and a sort of surreal backdrop to our daily activities. It's also the place that people now come for meetings and collaboration and public events, and increasingly for Instagram shots. For us, in many ways, this project reflects our attitude. It's systematized and pragmatic, as well as being handmade and playful. And it addresses sort of the difficulties of developing a low-cost project while really trying to be sort of generous and open-ended. For us, Sugar House Studios is an incredibly important space. It's a place of multidisciplinary activity where there's a live connectivity between art, design, architecture, and technology. In a broader context, the creative economy is incredibly important in the UK, both to our economy and to our cultural identity. But despite that fact, it's increasingly under threat. We're really, really engaged in sort of promoting and supporting projects which can sort of support and promote these types of activities.
So Paloma's talked about a couple of projects where we were very involved in setting up that kind of infrastructure for those organisations. But I'm going to talk now for a bit longer about our kind of ongoing work in Liverpool, in Granby, where we've kind of come in sort of 20 years into the project, really. And lots of those things are already very well established by a group of residents who've kind of been there for that throughout. And our work there takes numerous forms. It's kind of sort of supplementing many of the kind of grassroots things that they've initiated through more traditional design work, the creation of kind of shares in public spaces, and also setting up a new social enterprise, which is Granby Workshop. So the history of Liverpool, in some ways has echoes of Cape Town. It's an international port city that's benefited over the last few centuries from immigration. And in the case of, Granby was one of the few areas where sort of sailors from the boats would be able to buy, where they were permitted to buy and could afford to, in the city. So it has this very important kind of place there as a very kind of internationally diverse kind of area of Liverpool. Perhaps has some resonance with an area like District 6. And there's really, in the context of Liverpool itself, it therefore has a real symbolic importance. This wasn't something, at a time where the city was relatively divided, Granby kind of really stood out. And the social and kind of economic context of Granby mirrors that of Liverpool at large, a kind of post-industrial city suffering the symptoms of that decline, kind of shrinking population, lack of job provision, and fundamentally a mistrust of local government following a numerous kind of top-down regeneration initiatives that sought to address this problem of a shrinking population by reducing the housing stock, so the historic terraces that are so sort of identifiable with the areas, and replacing them with lower density typologies. And those are things which were resisted very actively by certain groups of residents who chose instead to kind of value the buildings as these kinds of symbols of a more prosperous era of Liverpool's past. And the communities that inhabited them prior to kind of riots in the 1980s, where kind of tensions had flared up and the authorities had sought to kind of come in and deal with the issue in quite an aggressive way. So following 2 decades of these regeneration efforts, the most recent being a kind of UK government programme called Pathfinder, which was cancelled in 2011, the streets were left in a mess, really. There was a kind of period of managed decline where roofs were taken off the houses. The council would kind of buy them back off residents, move the residents out, and then kind of quite carefully curate the dereliction of these areas. As one of the council leaders kind of said a few years ago, they left the streets like war zones. But within this context, as in 2011, when the kind of authorities sort of drew back, that left a kind of space, really, for the residents to kind of move into, the ones that had stayed and kind of fought to retain the buildings that they saw as very valuable. And so initially, through extending very domestic actions, such as kind of painting, cleaning and digging up the front yards and planting plants, they were able to change the way that this kind of derelict, visibly quite abrasive environment appeared. And through a series of initiatives like starting a street market there, really made an effort to kind of invite people in and encourage them to understand that the Granby that they read about in the papers was a very different Granby to the one that they'd experienced if they go there and kind of visit it as a place. So really in that kind of void created by the authority withdrawing, it gave a huge amount of freedom to the local residents in the area to kind of take initiative, start taking control of the streets, and really start thinking about how the future of the area might develop in a different way. And they had this vision, really, of reconstructing not only the buildings in the area that had been lost or left to fall derelict, but rebuilding the community as well, through a process that would enable kind of many people to take part, to sort of housing associations, to individuals, to long-standing residents, and new businesses that would need to come in as well. And that's really where we started working with them. It's kind of at this point, we'd originally kind of come to Liverpool to work on a project on an adjacent street with a similar kind of objective. And so what we helped the CLT do initially was kind of formulate a plan whereby their community land trust, which is quite a new form of kind of legal arrangement in the UK, whereby the council can give them land to kind of build the houses, or in this case, hand over the houses for free, which the CLT can then develop, but the land is always held in trust, so it stops the properties becoming kind of development vehicles or investment vehicles. The prices will always be in line with the kind of the market, the local market. So we helped them put together quite an incremental plan that thought at a local scale, firstly for the houses, the redevelopment of 10 on Cairn Street, which were in very poor condition, but also for kind of new public spaces that would take we kind of enliven the spaces, the streets themselves, and also rebuild the social infrastructure, as they'd started to do with the market space. So So the 10 houses on Cairn Street were the first part of this project, once the houses was kind of successfully handed over by the council. The houses are in incredibly poor condition, and I mean, these are two of the better ones, perhaps, but with the stair and a ceiling still in. But in many cases, the kind of roofs were off. That had caused kind of structural issues. So the strategy for delivering these houses, that ultimately on cost, they had to compete with the alternative, which was demolishing them and rebuilding them new. So you have to beat a kind of new build tax incentive to do that. So these houses had to be quite inventive in the way that they achieved, shoring up the structure. The spend had to be very pragmatic, but kind of inventive at the same time, trying to use these kind of spatial opportunities, sometimes at a small scale where a ceiling has fallen in a bedroom. Instead of rebuilding it with an attic, you just allow it to be there, you vault the room. So you get a different kind of space than you would usually in a sort of standard terraced house. And then there's larger scale projects which look at kind of public spaces, how to reintroduce uses to the high street or the historic Four Corners, for example. But the finishes of the houses themselves had to be very simple. The builders, as a local contractor, a big, large-scale contractor, so keeping these things very simple and standard as a way of ensuring that they could kind of carry out what they called the builder's finish, a sort of standard that they were very familiar with. That was the brief, really. It was sort of, in this stage, to make the project viable. But within this, we kind of learned a lot from looking at the residence houses as well. We spent a lot of time up there during this kind of quite, this lengthy process, and really started to understand how they had turned their houses into homes through this series of kind of colourful additions or the fabrics that they'd used in their properties, the way that they'd kind of personalised the spaces. And proposed to kind of append each house with a kind of highly bespoke, handmade range of furnishings that would restore some of the qualities of those original Victorian interiors that had been lost during that period of managed decline. So these quite formally simple objects or kind of items around the house that had a kind of material richness. We started with the mantelpieces kind of at the heart of the home, the symbolic heart of the houses. One of the kind of very familiar kind of tropes of the terraced house is this kind of expressed chimney breast that you get on the line of each house. And they were made by kind of gathering the demolition rubble, bits of old brick and slate from the area that were then reconstituted with these kind of colourful concrete pigment mixes that are then polished to kind of reveal them as these kind of like jewel-like things in these quite materially sort of beguiling furniture pieces. There's an emphasis on the things that you touch throughout the house, so these kind of cabinet handles and knobs on cupboards in the kitchens, in the bedrooms, in the living rooms. And a very sort of cheap use of standard 10p tiles with these kind of colourful abstract patterns on that could be made very quickly and cheaply as a way of kind of enriching the bathrooms in the house. And this ambition of rebuilding the social infrastructure of the area alongside the delivery of the houses had been a really important part of the project from the very beginning. But there hadn't been an opportunity to do that through the first 10 houses. We just had to get the 10 houses done, demonstrate that there was kind of trust and competence with the CLT so that they could kind of get more back from the council and the project could kind of expand. But when we were nominated last year for a big art award in the UK, the Turner Prize, that really created, it was a bit of a wild card for the project. Suddenly there was a huge amount of kind of press and public interest in this area. Like, what about it was so special? Why had it been nominated? It was a bit unclear to a lot of people, and it was initially perhaps a bit unclear to us as well, how this constituted an art project. But it really gave an impetus and a kind of a focus for us to set up, bring forward some of those things which maybe were kind of in the distant future for the project, to kind of initiate some of that kind of social infrastructure. And Granby Workshop is the first part of that. So it's a workshop that would set up and train a team of local people with an interest in making and a connection to Granby to produce not only the items for the remaining houses, but also a kind of new set of domestic furnishings that would then be sold at the exhibition as this kind of new range of stuff to promote Granby Workshop as an enterprise and hopefully generate kind of enough sales to sustain it for the first year and that it could grow and become a part of kind of Granby's future. So this very open-ended process of development began with an emphasis on material processes that were kind of simple to pick up, that you could become more skilled in over time, but that all enabled people to kind of have an agency in the way that they're making them. So we might make the mold or something like that, but it sort of define the process, but the people making them would make them different each time. So processes like this material, which is Granby rock, a kind of a range of bookends and concrete lights, which were made using kind of the odds and ends, the kind of end of the mixes of the mantelpieces. You can see the mantelpieces being made on the left, and these kind of smaller items which use that kind of waste material on the right. Very simple kind of techniques that would traditionally be applied to other materials, like marbling. And then, so there's this range of kind of marbled materials, taking very kind of cheap, readily available construction materials like cement board, and applying these kind of processes that added a kind of a color or a quality to them that really celebrated the kind of the randomness of the process. So these are other items in the range. There was some metal furniture with block printed fabrics and a kind of pressed terracotta lampshade that was made by sort of staining the bits of clay made and then pressed into a very simple plaster mold. And these ceramic handles which we showed earlier, which were made by using a very simple two-part mold that's then kind of fired in a sawdust barbecue. You throw in kind of banana skins and coffee granules, and whatever you put in there will kind of create a slightly different effect in the final product. And these were installed in the Turner Prize exhibition in Glasgow at Tramway Gallery as a kind of showroom. So all of the people coming to see the gallery could kind of go to the shop, select an item, maybe go away, walk away from the Turner Prize exhibition with a piece of art. And that was a very successful kind of launch for the project. It generated enough kind of support in that kind of initial opportunity to kind of reopen early this year and start production and hopefully play a kind of a bigger role in the future of the redevelopments that are going on in Granby.
So, in conclusion, our work in Liverpool is very much ongoing. This is our latest project, the Granby Winter Garden. It takes two of the houses on Cairn Street, which are in the worst condition and really far too costly to refurbish, and transforms them into a greenhouse. This is going to be a community-owned resource which contains an indoor garden, an artist residency space, as well as a community gathering space. For us, we really feel that it sort of nods to the history of the area, but also really ensures a continuation of the activities of creativity and collective action that have been so fundamental to the sort of change in the area. Our projects are really very small scale and local, but we feel that they begin to address some of the bigger questions, perhaps, about what it means to inhabit a city, and also begin to sort of give people the tools through which they can sort of transform them and create their own spatial futures. So thank you very much.